Our next guest here on Fuse Logic TV at the Analytics, Big Data and the Cloud Conference at West Edmonton Mall is Graham Irving. Now, Graham, you're with a company called Storage Clarity.
Yes.
And clarify that for me. What exactly
Well, Storage
do you do?
Clarity specializes in the preservation of big data. And what I mean by that is that we are collecting lots of data and we're keeping it for longer and longer time periods. And the reality is that many organizations underestimate the level of effort and the complexity of keeping data and preserving it, or what I like to say is protecting data over the duration of that data.
Okay, I'll just tell you first, your camera's over here, so just look at me, don't worry about that camera at all. Let's talk a little bit about storage. When it comes to capacity, what's being stored and where is it being stored?
Well, that's a good question. So when we talk about big data could mean to one person a couple terabytes, which is 1,000 a million bytes of data, or it could mean, let's say, to a radio astrometer, a zettabyte, which is, I think, 10 to the 15th in terms of bytes.
I would have just said is more.
Is more.
So, yeah.
So
okay.
It's all different. You know, the amount of data is massive. So it's anything from remote sensing, which in Alberta would be seismic data, for example, or collecting images from satellites, or it could be agricultural data. Or it could be accounting information or tax records, GST. I guess another good one for Alberta would be the gun registry, for example.
For Canada,
for Canada, yeah.
Well, and they're talking about, I mean, they're disbanding that. What are they going to do with the information in it, right?
Well, that's...
The federal government says, let's destroy it. The Quebec government says, we want to keep it.
I'm not going to go there.
Fair enough.
But the destruction, the retention and the destruction of information is absolutely critical as we go on. Because the reality is that there's always the chance that the information in the future will be misused. It'll be used for purposes other than what it was designated for.
Okay, so it's interesting that you mentioned that, because we were talking to somebody yesterday and just saying it seems fine to give the information today. Just like at one time it seemed fine to talk to a communist until McCarthy came in the US, and even if you had been known to talk to a communist, you were deemed a communist, and of course your career in life was ruined. So it all depends on who's in power as to whether or not your information is safe.
Oh, and I think it's also perception. So if you look at Facebook, for example, and you're a teenager, there may be some very, very interesting photos posted up on your wall. And then let's say 10, 15 years later, you're out looking for that executive job, and the recruiter or the potential employer is looking at your Facebook page or pulling up some of these quote-unquote party pictures. And the issue is, do you really want that information existing for extended time periods?
Right.
So and right now we have little or no control over how long people can keep information about us.
Okay, I know when I keep information for myself, financial records and sort, 7 years, maybe even a little bit longer if I'm not going through and culling what I don't need. But you're telling me that right now information is being kept on me that could be older than that.
Yeah, well, 7 years is sort of the rule in the Western world because of accounting. So for tax purposes, the Revenue Canada can go back 7 years and no further. So we have to keep those records whether we're a business or whether we're a personal. But there's nothing to say that people don't keep information, even your accountant or even the government keeps that information for longer. It just says that we don't have an obligation to have that information. But it doesn't say that other people have to destroy that information.
So should we be concerned about that?
We should.
Why?
Because, again, information is power. So we can see some very interesting trends over extended time periods. And you may not want someone knowing that. Now, I think financial information is maybe not so interesting, but if you take a look at healthcare information, that is really critical. Because if you look at patient records, and as we move to electronic systems, the issue becomes is who has access to that information, especially if it's from our birth to our death. Because you can imagine the analytics involved with insurance companies if they could access that information, because they could determine your risk factor and essentially deny you services based on something that maybe occurred 20 years earlier in your life. So lots of things.
Yet you're looking at a health record, and to me it makes sense to keep that for the duration of your life. I guess it depends on where it ends up.
And how it's protected.
Right. Are the protection mechanisms in place right now, do you think?
Not to my belief. I think that we're still experimenting with that information and how to disseminate that information. I don't think that there's a risk at this point for the wrong parties, but I think as we move to an electronic healthcare system, that's going to be very important. A great analogy would be SIN numbers, Social Security numbers, with the fact that many years ago we all freely handed out our SIN numbers as we were asked for insurance and for other purposes, credit checks, etc. That is one of the rare numbers that can identify us, no matter who you are. In other words, to correlate and look up information about you. Nowadays, you don't want to be giving out your SIN number for personal identification, theft issues, etc. You want to keep that restricted to who you have to give it out. So I think we want to be very careful about how our information is disseminated and what parties actually have access, because in many cases that information is owned by us, not by the government.
Well, you say it's owned by us, but if we don't even know what's being kept on us, how can we govern over it?
Well, and that's a bit of an evolution that I think has to occur in the next few years, is that the government is the custodian in many cases of information. We are the owners, and that we should have rights with respect to how that information is used and when that information is destroyed.
Well, you even talk about health records. While we have the right to look at them, I just wonder what the percentage of people is that actually have looked at their health records.
I think most people don't even realize the extent of health records and the fact that they do have some rights with respect to how they see those. But I think there are perceived barriers or obstacles, and there's just been no communication with respect to what we can and can't do with our information.
So how do we watch out for ourselves then? I mean, you mentioned Facebook and you know, the younger generation not posting, revealing pictures and that sort of thing. But really, if we're not aware of where all the information is being collected or where it's going, how do we protect ourselves?
That's a really good question, because there really is no organization per se, I think, that's really looking out for us as individuals. And I think, but as we go forward and then the government collects more information and starts utilizing this information more, we're going to see, I believe, almost like an ombudsman, whether it's with respect to privacy and or information, and how this information is being used, whether it's federally or provincially.
Well, it's interesting when you hear companies talk about analytics and being able to use this, and the phrase that's often used is, we'll be able to serve our customers better, you know, which is true, which means they'll be able to make more money, which is their ultimate goal. But are we being served better by giving up all this information, or are we being targeted now?
That's a two-edged sword. So it all depends on the people that have access to the information and what they're doing with it.
And who owns the data is key, you say, and that's what we've got to figure. I mean, you say you know who owns it. We own our own data, basically. But
in concept,
yes.
The issue is whether we have a legal system and rights and all that stuff is actually put into action.
Okay, and looking at the way government moves, which is not always at a tremendously quick pace, and most of the people I've talked to at this conference say that regulations and laws are way behind where they need to be right now. Do you see this changing at all in the
it's changing it's changing rapidly, but it's changing in vertical markets. So I think to the average person, they're not seeing that change, but we're definitely seeing an adopting of health records systems, and privacy is very, very important in those systems, and that's one of the reasons why we're not seeing it just rolled out really fast. We're also seeing, let's say, in the court systems, with respect to legal documents and evidence, the ability to submit emails, the ability to submit electronic records. Even financial institutes are going through challenges with respect to they have a choice now of either keeping the paper or keeping the electronic information, but they can't keep both, because you can't have two originals, and you can't, because that just doesn't work. So in a court of law, there's got to be one. So odds are they're going to keep the electronics, which means that the paper goes away, has to be destroyed. So we're coming up to points in time, because of legal system, where we will have to destroy information, that we will have to preserve it for set time periods, and then we'll have the optional choice of keeping it longer. But we're going to have to be really much better at managing and preserving our data over what we call the life cycle, cradle to grave of that data.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because one of the things here is we don't throw out any data. And that's one of the things with big data, is that you keep everything because you never know when you might need it.
Remote sensing, that's very true, like seismic data, or let's say satellite information, etc. Definitely, you want to be keeping that as long as you can afford to keep it. But when it comes to financial information, healthcare information, etc., corporations, let's say, are going to be very careful, or even individuals, because of liability issues. And that, particularly in the United States, they have laws that are called e-discovery, for example, which basically dictate how business records are kept and allow other organizations to look at your business records from an electronic perspective. And therefore, when you go into a court system or a legal system, a discovery as they call it, and you have to present your information, you're presenting it electronically. But if you have a policy that says, I keep my emails for 7 years, and you walk into a court in many US states, and you can't show all your emails for 7 years, your case could be thrown out that way. Because they're being very rigid about the fact if you have a policy that says we keep data for 7 years, then you better have it all.
Right.
If you're missing little chunks, you've got inconsistencies, then the case could be thrown out.
Okay, and then also if you've got data that goes back farther than 7 years, that could jeopardize.
Well, absolutely, because in a discovery process, the opposition could basically say, I want to see everything, and they could be digging up all sorts of information on you to build their case against the corporation or the individual. So you don't want information being used against you. So once it's served its purpose, if it doesn't have value, or it has risk, then I would be destroying it.
Okay. Before we go, have you got any tips for the average person as far as protecting themselves? Because one thing I heard is that privacy is not as big an issue today, it's maintaining your identity, if you can distinguish between the two. But what would you say to the average person out there who's listening to some of these interviews and might be a little bit nervous?
Protect your private data. In other words, items like SIN numbers, items like bank accounts, driver licenses, don't take those for granted. Identity theft is a huge problem in North America. It's growing massively, and if it happens to you, it's very difficult to unwind. Okay,
and we're not just talking about, I'm talking about how do you protect yourself also from these groups that are gathering all this information from you?
I don't think there's too much you can do. The reality is, to function in society today, you're going to use credit cards, you're going to be, you know, a good example of what came up yesterday was the fact that you're in a shopping center and they're taking videos of you. They're not just using those videos to determine if you're stealing. They're using those videos to determine your flow, what items you're pulling off shelves. They're using that information in many, many different ways. So just be aware that when you're in public, when you're using credit cards or online, you're being watched.
Okay, you're not making me feel any better, but but I mean, that's just the reality of it.
It's the reality of our society, and you just have to accept it or become a hermit and go live in a cave.
Fair enough. Graham, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, we've been chatting with Graham Irving from Storage Clarity.